All right, the last thing we're going to cover in this section is objects. So let's declare an employee object with an ID property. Now, you know that in JavaScript, objects are dynamic, so their shape can change throughout the lifetime of our programs. So once we have an employee object, then later we can give it a new property like name, and this is totally valid in JavaScript. But as you can see, this is not valid in TypeScript. The compiler is saying property name does not exist on this type. So this type is an object with an ID property, which is a number. So just like all the variables we have declared so far, the TypeScript compiler has inferred the shape of this employee object. So if you hover our mouse over employee, we can see its shape. It's an object with an ID that is a number. Now, just like all the variables we have declared so far, we can explicitly apply a type annotation here. So after employee, we add a colon followed by braces, and inside the braces, we define the properties of an employee object. So every employee should have an ID that is a number and a name that is a string. Now the previous error on this line is gone, but we have a new kind of error. Let's find out. The compiler is saying property name is missing. So the reason we're seeing this is because every employee should have these two properties, but while initializing this object, we haven't supplied the name property. Now here we have two options. One option is to set the name to an empty string. We cannot set it to null or undefined. We'll talk about this in the next section. So we should either set it to an empty string, or we can make this property optional, and then we don't have to supply the name property while initializing an employee. Now, even though TypeScript allows us to do something like this is something we should avoid, because conceptually, it doesn't make sense to have an employee without a name. Every employee should have a name. It would make sense to make the fax property optional because not everyone has a fax machine, right? So always make sure the code you write conceptually makes sense. Don't blindly use features of TypeScript or any other programming languages, okay? So in this case, we're not going to use an optional property, and that means we should either set the name to an empty string or initialize it right here, okay? Now we have an error because I used a period. Okay. So now we don't need this last line anymore. Okay. Now, sometimes we want to make certain properties read-only so we don't accidentally change them later on. So with our current implementation, we can change the ID of an employee anytime. And this is not valid. This is where we use the read-only modifier. So we apply it before the name of the property, and now the TypeScript compiler prevents us from accidentally modifying the value of this property, okay? Good. Now, how can we define a function, or more accurately, a method in this object? Let's say every employee object should have a retire method. So in our type annotation, we need to define the signature of this method. We need to specify how many parameters it's going to have, what is the type of each parameter, and what is the type of the return value. So we're going to have a retire method with one parameter, that is date. Now here we use the arrow function syntax. So first we add parentheses, and inside parentheses, we specify the parameters. So we're going to have a date parameter of type date. This is just a built-in date object in JavaScript and TypeScript. So we only have one parameter. Then we use a fat arrow, and here we specify the type of the return value. We don't want to return any value, so we're going to use void. Now we have a compilation error saying property retire is missing, because when initializing this object, we haven't supplied the retire method. So let's do that real quick. All right, retire is going to be a method with one parameter. And over here, I just want to log the date on the console. Pretty simple. So this is how we can work with objects. Now I know this syntax, this type annotation is a little bit messy. It's making our code a bit verbose or noisy. So in the next section, I'll show you a better way to work with objects.